Kemco finally gets it right on NES Works episode 160.
Thank you. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Kiss my ass.
How do you solve a problem like Kemco Sega? Despite being one of Nintendo's oldest and most established third-party partners, the name Kemco was not exactly synonymous with quality. Kemco got by almost entirely on timing. As one of the earliest licensees for Famicom, the company enjoyed unique status and privilege in the cutthroat world of 8-bit gaming. Going off of information in Stefan Gonser's book, The History of Sunsoft Volume 1, Kemco appears to have been one of the first 8 third parties who established a presence on Famicom in its earliest days. Having a foot in the door so early on in the console race meant that Kemco was there for the salad days. That brief window in 1985 when ownership of the console exploded, but the library hadn't quite caught up yet. For a little while, literally anything published on Famicom sold at least 500,000 copies. Numbers that would make all but the absolute chart toppers seethe with envy just a couple of years later. Sales in that halcyon period didn't necessarily reflect quality, though, and Kemco was the poster child for that reality. Kemco locked down licenses for a ton of Western properties, both games to convert and intellectual properties to adapt, which made them somewhat unique. I mean, Hudson had paved the way with its reinventions of American Bruderbund hits Lode Runner and Raid on Bungling Bay, but those localized releases comprised only a tiny fraction of Hudson's prodigious output. On the other hand, Kemco's releases were like 50% Western properties by mass. The Awkward Doughboy, the functional, if unremarkable, Spy vs. Spy and its sequel, the rambling and bizarre Superman. Kemco's most visible releases originated in the US, and it's hard to say that the company necessarily did them anything like justice. Among those conversions was a Famicom adaptation of a moderately obscure computer game called Deja Vu, a detective-oriented murder mystery graphical adventure. Released in Japan in November 1988, Kemco's version of Deja Vu was quite transparently an attempt by the developer to jump on the detective adventure bandwagon that Enix had kicked off with Portopio Renzoku Setsujin Jiken. In that light, you can easily understand why Kemco opted to pick up Deja Vu. Every Famicom publisher worth its salt had a murder mystery in 1987 or 88, and Kemco made use of its reach into the US to take a shortcut. Rather than create their own detective game, they simply picked up one of the few American examples of the format that existed at the time and reworked it for Famicom. You have to admire the gambit. And to be fair, Kemco wasn't a total stranger to the graphical adventure genre. They had adapted Time Stranger, an anime directed by Taku Murayama and featuring character designs by the legendary Moto Hagio, the Famicom Disk System at the end of 1986. Kemco's rendition of Deja Vu rearranges the original game to look an awful lot like Time Stranger. Not that it had a great distance to bridge to get there. Deja Vu belonged to the MacVenture series, a set of 4 games produced by ICOM Simulations between 1985 and 88. What makes those 4 games so remarkable is that they were heavily oriented around a visual interface, even by the standards of graphical adventures. ICOM programmed them for the new at the time Macintosh computer platform. That meant the game suffered from the limitations of the early Mac era, such as 1-bit color depth and teeny tiny media storage capacity. But they also enjoyed the unique advantages of that platform, such as remarkably high graphical resolution and, above all, a mouse and cursor interface. This made the MacVenture series remarkably easy to adapt into console form. You may recall, long ago, when I covered Portopia, I celebrated the excellent work that designer Yuji Horii and programmer Koichi Nakamura did in transplanting that game's text parser interface to the 2-button Famicom controller through the use of a window system. Well, for Deja Vu, Kemco didn't have to put in nearly so much effort. ICOM had already designed the game around a largely visual, not to mention nonverbal, interface in the first place. Rather than redesign the game, Kemco really just had to figure out how to squeeze it into the Famicom's limitations. And it seemingly did okay for them. Enough for them to license 2 of the other 3 MacVenture titles, at least. Which brings us to Shadowgate, the second of the 3 Kemco MacVenture conversions, and the first to see US release. I could not tell you why Kemco Seika skipped localizing Deja Vu in order to bring Shadowgate to NES first, but I can confirm that it was the correct choice. It's wild in hindsight to look at Shadowgate in the context of other adventure games available for consoles in the US at the time. This release may not seem totally impressive compared to its PC contemporaries like Maniac Mansion and Loom, but let's keep the comparisons in the all apples zone here. Shadowgate for NES feels a generation or two ahead of literally every other graphical adventure available on consoles at the time of its release. It is so much more refined, playable, attractive, literate, and user-friendly than the direct competition that it's not even funny. A lot of that gets back to the source material, sure. The original Shadowgate was a hell of a game, but most of the credit is due to Kemco's designers and programmers, who radically stepped up their game here to reinterpret Shadowgate for NES with more elegance and sophistication than anyone really could have imagined at the time. How did this game come from the same company responsible for Superman and Crazy Castle? Even the company's best creation to date, Desert Commander, feels clumsy and primitive compared to Shadowgate. This is hands down the smoothest and most elegant adventure-style game we've ever seen on NES. I've mentioned before that Portopia's Famicom interface begat Dragon Quest, which we saw, in August 1989, as Dragon Warrior. Shadowgate makes that game look hilariously archaic, and that's with all the enhancements and improvements that HAL reprogrammed the NES release of Dragon Warrior with. Compare this to other contemporary releases like King's Quest on Master System, or ALF, or Who Framed Roger Rabbit, or Defender of the Crown, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that Kemco was some elite A-tier NES developer rather than the ramshackle C-listers that they actually were. Some kind of special magic happened here, and however it came to be, it had a genuine, lasting impact. Not only did Shadowgate elevate Kemco's status as a publisher among NES fans, it also helped cement Shadowgate as an all-time video game classic. Now, the original Mac release of the game reviewed well and was hardly garbage, and the Amiga port a year later was even more impressive. But Shadowgate managed to present the perfect balance of elements at the perfect time to cement itself as an all-timer. It has an intriguing theme, memorable text, excellent visuals, and as buttery smooth a visual interface as you could possibly imagine on a console with no mouse controls. Shadowgate landed right at the point of peak NES, too, hitting a console with a vastly greater install base than the Mac or Amiga could ever have dreamed, maximizing its reach and impact. It's a memorable game, somehow managing to be both incredibly hostile to the player, yet remarkably forgiving. And it feels years ahead of its time, the kind of experience you'd expect to find on Nintendo DS, not NES. In classic adventure game style, Shadowgate drops players alone into an unfamiliar and deeply unforgiving environment. You have to solve a succession of environment-based puzzles in order to complete a specific objective, and everything you interact with has the potential to murder you without warning. And kill you it does. Shadowgate does not refrain from hitting you with an instant game over when you least expect it. Pick up an object when you should simply look at it, dead. Use the wrong item or weapon on a monster, dead. Walk through a door flanked by immobile gargoyles, dead. Shadowgate contains dozens of booby traps that will immediately bring your game to an end, as memorably denoted by its iconic Grim Reaper portrait. It's almost a game of random guesswork as you try to piece together your objectives and the steps you need to take in order to achieve them without dying, and in any other game this approach would be utterly infuriating. Somehow though, Shadowgate manages to be fun rather than infuriating. And that is because death, as constant and fickle as it may be, barely counts as a setback here. Yes, you die all the time in Shadowgate, but that's fine because you lose maybe a minute's worth of progress when you bite the dust. When the Grim Reaper appears, you can choose to continue your game, and selecting continue simply sends you back to the last room you visited, with the world's state reverted to the way it was when you moved to the room that killed you. So you trigger a trap or choose the wrong combat strategy against a monster. You die, and you can continue, and immediately try to solve that puzzle again. You don't even need to make use of the save feature. The manual save option has no bearing on continuing after death, it just determines where you'll begin if you take a break from your current play session. It's hard to convey just how forward-thinking and extremely not NES-like this approach was. I mean, it wasn't PC-like either. The Master System version of King's Quest, with its sudden, unpredictable, unavoidable deaths that send you back to the beginning of the game or wherever you recorded a password, was pretty representative of most computer adventure games at this point in time. Lucasfilm Games was the rare exception, and even they had only just turned a corner into kindness with The Secret of Monkey Island. Shadowgate's low-friction approach makes for a perfect console adaptation. It's quick, breezy, and never too frustrating. That's not to say that Shadowgate doesn't present players with real stakes and actual challenge. Although you have the freedom to throw yourself at puzzles and hazards as many times as you like, with very little time wasted on retracing your steps, there's still a hard limit on the number of turns you can take to complete the game. As you travel through the corridors of Castle Shadowgate, you need to carry a lit torch with you at all times. Otherwise, in classic Zork style, you're plunged into darkness and instantly die. No grooves here, but the game ends all the same. When the music changes to the urgent low light theme and your torch icon in the upper right corner dwindles to a mere flicker, you need to light a spare torch from your inventory to prevent a catastrophic game over. And there are a finite number of torches to collect in the castle. Each action you take besides looking, whether that's moving, fighting, or interacting, counts against the torch's durability. It's a little like a roguelike, really, in that the system only goes through its routine when you act. Each torch lasts for more than 60 turns, and the game contains something like 24 torches for you to collect around the castle for your use, so you'd really have to whiff it in order to die. Still, a hard turn limit does exist, and if nothing else, the constant threat of darkness and death, and the occasional stretches of the game where you can burn through several torches without uncovering a new one, does create a sense of urgency in an otherwise sedate game. And let's be honest, a lot of Shadowgate's solutions and deaths are totally arbitrary. Just about everything you need to do here does operate on a certain logic, and the central quest objectives, to stop an evil wizard from summoning a terrifying behemoth from the deep, are all outlined in riddle form throughout the adventure. But Shadowgate involves a lot of trial and error, which is fine. If you error, you go back a screen and try again. However, in a lot of cases, you'll reach a screen that contains a puzzle you can't solve yet. Early on, for example, you'll enter a room where a skeleton holds an important key on the far side of a pool patrolled by a shark. In order to pass the shark, you need to freeze the water, which you can do with an orb, which you'll find in a later room, but which you can only access by solving an object-based puzzle, taking the orb, and then intuiting that you need to drop it into the water. Oh, and then you'll need to retrieve the orb once you have the key, or else you won't be able to pass a later obstacle. Instead, you'll die. Shadowgate is very much of the try everything and use everything on everything else until something works school of design, though in its defense, the constant deaths are almost always hilarious in their swift brutality and finality, and the game does at least try to provide some hints and suggestions in its text. ICOM really just created a visual version of Zork here. Different puzzles, different layout, no baseball riddle, but fundamentally this is very much a Zork-like experience that simply plays out with graphics. Zork had done that as well by 1989 with Zork Zero, but Shadowgate beat that game to market by a couple of years, and frankly, this feels infinitely more elegant than anything Infocom ever came up with, thanks in large part to its mouse-driven interface, which of course is a controller-based interface on NES. But it somehow feels almost as quick and effective on NES as it does on a system with a mouse. The thing that stands out to me most about Shadowgate's interface is the fluidity with which it switches between modes. You can use this as a sort of traditional console menu system, as the active adventure window is surrounded by virtual cards that contain selectable elements, your lists of inventory items, destinations, verbs, and reflexive elements like self. You can click on these as you move the cursor over them, but in many cases you can also click on objects within the adventure window. So when you want to move around the map, you can use the D-pad like a mouse and float the cursor over to the door you want to use. Or you can just click on the corresponding icon point in the map window and jump between spaces quickly and efficiently. I realize interface design is not the most exciting thing in the world when it comes to video games, but the elegance of Kemco's approach to bringing Shadowgate to NES sincerely cannot be overstated. It's art, pure and simple, and it works beautifully on this console. It makes Shadowgate feel leaps and bounds more playable than something like Defender of the Crown, which also had a sort of virtual mouse interface, but whose approach kind of sucked if we're being honest. The low friction interface and mild penalties for failure make Shadowgate a pleasure to play. It can be a little frustrating when you overlook, say, a hidden door, whose presence can only be ascertained by spotting a faint, single pixel gray outline amidst a sea of gray, and therefore find yourself unable to proceed. As in the classic Metroidvania, backtracking is a lot of fun until that freedom leaves you stuck in a vast dead end without a clue to progressing. Nevertheless, despite its modest flaws and the shortcomings of age and tech, Shadowgate stands out as one of the highlights of an incredibly strong year of NES releases. The console's library really expanded over the course of 1989, and games like Shadowgate demonstrated how brilliantly it could present games for far more powerful systems in genres that hadn't traditionally worked on consoles. Apparently, the secret was just to step back and give it a lot of thought. And Kemco was understandably proud of what they pulled off here. Not only did they bring 2 more MacVenture games to the US with Deja Vu and Uninvited, they also completely pilfered the screen layout and interface setup that they had kinda sorta co-created here for a few original Game Boy games. The 2 Swords of Hope and the Japan-only Nekojara Monogatari. Now, when I covered Sword of Hope back in the early days of Game Boy works, I criticized Kemco for blatantly stealing the MacVenture framework as their own. But now, revisiting Shadowgate in the context of its contemporaries, I gotta say, they earned it. Next time on NES Works, nothing says Valentine's Day like a little romance. Wouldn't you agree?